My name is Matthew Stanley. I'm a professor of the history of science at the Gallatin School at New York University, and it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholars presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by NYU's Center for Ancient Studies, and I would like to thank Matthew Santarocco and Maura Pollard for their support of this series. The Emerging Scholars series showcases the research of current PhD candidates, and we are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and/or methods. Today's speaker is Tejas Arulari, a PhD candidate in classical studies at UC Santa Barbara. He'll now introduce us to his important and fascinating work, and then we'll have some time to discuss a few points in more detail. Tejas?
Thank you, Dr. Stanley, for that introduction. And thank you to NYU for putting this series together and giving me this opportunity. So my research is on the intersections of ancient Indian and ancient Mediterranean science. And I am particularly interested right now in this idea of the Melothesia, which is this arrangement of the 12 zodiac signs that you find in Babylonian science on the human body. And it first appears in ancient Rome in an epic astrological poem by Manilius, who we don't know anything about, but he seems to have been writing during the rule of Augustus. So scholars have given him a date of around 20, the work at least, a date of around 20 to 40 CE. And a lot of the scholarship doesn't really try to pick apart this idea of Melothesia in his work. And some of the scholars just say, oh, it's, pedantic fluff, sort of. And they don't really, they can't really find an explanation for it. What makes it even more interesting, though, I think, is that it shows up approximately, a century, 2 centuries later in a Sanskrit text in India. And that text is called the Yavana Jataka, which has been translated as the Greek horoscopy. But I think, the title should be something more, or the translation should be more something along the lines of a foreign or a Western horoscopy. And it's a Sanskrit text that is written with 79 chapters. And the very, very beginning of the text, in the first chapter, the opening verses give a Melothesia, where it's the same exact arrangement that we find in Manilius's poem. And it's been arranged onto the body of the Vedic creator deity, Purusha Prajapati, who is talked about in the Vedas, the sacred liturgical texts of India, starting from 1200 BC at least. And so he shows up in a series of other texts and mythological narratives before then. But now in the 1st or 2nd century CE, we see him being aligned with this foreign idea of Melothesia, which is coming in to India somehow. And that's sort of the unclear part, is how it came in. And so the reason I'm interested in this is because the scholarship that exists on it so far, first, hasn't really been able to explain how the Melothesia originated or what it really does. And so part of my work is trying to make sense of that. And then the other part of it, and sort of more broadly, is to pick apart and sort of problematize and to reanalyze the exchange of scientific information in antiquity. So there's this, this almost Orientalist, colonialist narrative, which has only recently been started to be questioned. But it essentially says that rational knowledge originated in democratic Athens and Greece, and was taken to the Romans a little bit. They adopted it, and only during the Hellenistic age, with the travels of Alexander the Great, did it make its way over to the irrational East. So India, which was not as rational and mathematical and scientific, whatever that term means in antiquity, the Greeks brought that with them when they came to India. And the way the first translator of the Sanskrit text creates a narrative about how it was created and everything. And he says that it must have been translated from a lost Greek original that was written in Alexandria, Egypt, during the Hellenistic age, and then translated into Sanskrit sometime in the 2nd century CE. A direct translation, and the original has been lost. And that sort of a narrative, right, clearly doesn't work when you start working on the actual text, on the Sanskrit text, and you start finding the connections which exist in the commentary that was written by David Pingree, who first translated this text. You start finding that, okay, there are some ideas that are definitely Greek, that are definitely Mediterranean in their origin, but they have been almost completely transformed, and they had to be, in order to fit into the new metaphysical systems, the new astrological and astral science systems, the religious systems, the political systems, all of these things that create a culture, right? And the language as well, right? So all of these things had to be applied to this idea, and it totally reshapes the reason that the idea is even adopted and the ways in which the idea is applied. So to pick apart this, this idea that rationality spread from the West to the East. And so, we have to look at individual examples. And that's what I'm trying to do with my study of the Melothesia, is to analyze this one example, right, which appears for the first time in both of these texts, one in Rome, one in India, one in Imperial Rome, which notoriously had a lot of trade relations with India, and another in India, which was developing into a series of different kingdoms that was starting to build its own empires a little bit, but had a very rich scientific and philosophical history of its own, right? And we have to start putting together these ideas of how these ideas, these theories that travel, change and transform in order to fit into the places that they're going. And also acknowledge that the Orientalist narrative that and sort of the colonialist narrative that knowledge comes in from the West doesn't really hold true when we analyze the texts and let them speak for themselves. And so what I found in doing a bit of this analysis is that in Rome and in Manilius's work, the idea of Melothesia and the idea of connecting the body to the zodiac and to the astrological signs is something that he's doing to further an imperialist ideology, right? And he's doing this by trying to make sense of, it seems, all the new types of peoples and countries and languages that have now become part of this new Roman Empire, right? So Roman Imperium, the right to rule that the emperor has now spread all around the Mediterranean and goes all the way up to the borders of India. So we're repeatedly told in the poetry and Roman imperial literature. And he's trying to make sense of how does the zodiac, which became popular primarily because Augustus, the first Roman emperor, started publicizing his own horoscope. So he publishes his horoscope for the very first time, and they think around in 11 CE, he publishes his horoscope. And that is when astrology, which had been seen as this foreign science, compared to older Roman practices that were state sanctioned, like augury and reading of entrails, right? So these older practices that were state sanctioned and had been part of Roman Republican state and politics and religion sort of get transitioned away from during the imperial era. And Augustus brings in astrology as this new science. And what I think we see Manilius doing is he connects this idea of the Melothesia, where the zodiac controls or influences different parts of the body, to the imperial body. So there are passages where he talks about how the Libra, which was actually Augustus's birth sign and not Capricorn, which he puts all over his imperial propaganda on coins and public monuments and things like that. This idea of Libra as a sign that is the scales of justice and everything, he connects that to Augustus, since he was born under that as a sun sign, and says he is the perfect person to give justice and laws to the entire Roman Empire. And part of this, he connects, or seems to be connecting, to earlier ideas of Hippocratic medicine and Vitruvian writings that talk about environmental determinism, which is this idea that one's environment completely determines who they are. So if you are born in Spain, you have a certain set of physical and psychological, right, physiological qualities that you have because of where you're from. And this applies to the animals and the places, right? And what he's doing is applying this to the entire Roman Empire. And he does this sort of methodically. And so the Melothesia, which we don't know where he gets exactly, it serves him as a really valuable tool to start doing this work, right? To start connecting the empire, these disparate places in the empire, these bodies that don't look Italian, right? These bodies that are over in Africa that don't look Italian. He's able to connect them to Rome and try to bring sort of a narrative of unity. That entire framework doesn't really exist at all when we get to the Sanskrit text, where the focus is more on Vedic religious ritual. It's on the regulation of bodies, who can perform the yajna, which is the fire sacrificial ritual that was at the center of a Brahminical and Vedic life. So who can perform it? And there's a lot more interest in connecting it to the earlier mythological frameworks and the earlier astrological sciences that had been in India, at least since 800 BCE. So these had developed to mark the locations of different astrological signs there were 28 of them in the Indic system, or in the Sanskrit sciences. And they were using these 28 different signs and the movement of the moon through them to mark when certain fire sacrifices or yajnas had to be done. So it's into that context that we get the Melothesia then moving into India, it seems like. And the author, the poet who composed the Yavanajataka, Spujidvaja, who we also don't know anything about, just like Manilius, he composed this text firmly within this framework. And we see him connecting to epic, Sanskrit epics. He's composing in an epic meter. He's talking about ideas that are related to the social classes, the 4 social classes that existed in ancient India, the Brahmins, all the way down to the Shudras. And so he's really contextualizing this idea that's coming from maybe Greece, maybe Rome, into the Vedic, Brahminical context that he's working in, living in. And so it really throws the earlier theory about the origins of this text sort of out the window, right? Unless there was a Greek who had intimate knowledge of the technicalities of Brahminical literature, religion, sciences, sociology, the legal systems, all of which show up in the Yavanajataka, right? There's 79 chapters that talk about different aspects of astrology and how they all relate to these branches of Indic knowledge. There's no way he could have composed such an elaborate text. And so that's sort of the framework within which I'm picking apart this idea of Melothesia and trying to understand more broadly the ways in which ideas moved around the ancient world, right? And I think that we have to move away from the scavenger hunt model, which is sort of how the scholarship has worked so far. And it's, oh, this idea shows up in this text, which is dated to this time. And so let's make a timeline of all the different texts when this idea appears in each of them, and talk about how different cultures learned from each other. I think that is a good starting point for understanding the ancient sciences. We need to have a framework of some sort to begin, but I think that should be just the first step. And I think the analysis of the Melothesia, which is just one example that I'm working on, shows this, right? You can't fully understand something like the Melothesia without fully contextualizing and understanding what is already written in those cultures, what the entire literature says about these ideas that are picked up in the scientific writings. And so the scavenger hunt method of finding text that's connected to another text is good in getting us started, but we have to move beyond that. And that's sort of what my work more broadly is trying to do as I reevaluate these connections and these scientific exchanges between ancient India and the ancient Mediterranean. And I think the last thing is that until we move beyond this idea of, who thought it first, right? Who thought it first? Did the Greeks think it first? Did the Indians think it first? That is important, yes, because we need to know sort of a timeline, once again, of these ideas. But I think by doing that, we miss the point of, okay, how did these cultures, if someone else thought it first and it got to some other place, and we don't usually know how it gets wherever it goes, but how did those people make sense of it? Why did they deem it worthy to even spend the effort, the time to contextualize this idea and use it in their own sciences? And a lot of the discussion has been mostly on this idea of, oh, it was better, and they knew it was better. But even in our ancient sources, so at least in the case of India and the Mediterranean, the term Yavana, which originally, in probably the 5th century BC, when we know that there were some interactions between the Greeks and the Indians, or Greek intermediaries who are coming close to India, it originally means Greek. But soon after, especially by the time that this text is written, the first couple centuries CE, the term Yavana is essentially equal to the term barbarian, right? So if you know the Greek term barbarian, it means, in antiquity, it means someone who doesn't speak Greek, right? They are uncivilized, they're a foreigner. And in Sanskrit, there's a similar term that dates back to around the 5th century BCE in a grammar text, where the grammarian, Parnini, makes fun of the way these foreigners speak, right? So he's thought to have composed his work somewhere in northwestern India, and he says these foreigners, these mlechas, that's the term he uses, these mlechas are not, they don't speak grammatically correct Sanskrit. They don't write grammatically correct Sanskrit. So there's this bias already there from so early on in the Indian scholarship and the Indian intellectual community against these Western peoples. And by the time we come to the 2nd century CE, the 1st century CE, the term Yavana means something very similar. It means these barbarians who are from the north, from the northwest. So we have to I think, contextualize and reanalyze, a lot of it due to new evidence that we keep finding in newer scholarship. But we have to reanalyze the ways in which these ideas moved, and talk about why people picked them up and why they thought they were worthy of even adopting. And the sciences and the study of ancient science has been so focused on these mathematical ideas, these particular technical terminologies, which once again is a good starting point. But when we start looking at how these ideas are applied, right, and with something as broadly popular as astrology, that was connected to all aspects of life in Rome and in the Mediterranean and in India, we have to move, I think, a little bit out of that strict framework of science. And so, yeah, my dissertation is going to look at the exchanges and how these ideas develop a bit more broadly between ancient India and the Mediterranean. And so the Melothesia is one of my examples in trying to analyze this relationship and trying to figure out how these ideas moved around and what people did with them.
This was wonderful material. I've got lots of questions. I'd like to start off by asking a little bit about the last point you had just made, in which you sort of suggested that too much attention to just the scientific aspects can cause us some problems. And it sounds to me like you're suggesting that it's really important that we read these documents as whole texts, that is, taking seriously the scientific, political, and religious aspects kind of holistically. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about why it's important to do that, and maybe also comment on why scholars haven't done that kind of reading in the past.
Yeah, this problem, I think, with focusing on the technical terms, part of it is you need that foundation to begin figuring out where these texts came from and what they were being used for. But I think we have to move beyond that, because after all, both Manilius's Astronomica and the Sanskrit, the Yavana Jataka, are both written in meter, right? They are poetry, which was pretty sort of standard practice in Rome, where you would have a didactic poet. The most famous, of course, is Lucretius, who wrote De Rerum Natura on the atomic theory. And the idea that you would be able, first of all, to compose such complex mathematical ideas into verse, into epic meter, which by this time was famous for Virgil's, or through Virgil's Aeneid, the sort of the most important authoritative text in ancient Rome. You find that you have these poets who are working on this, and it's not just a prose manual that's being written for your everyday astrologer to use. And so part of it is to understand how and why these texts take on a poetic structure and framework. And then the other part of it is to start actually figuring out what happened and how these ideas were actually applied to people's lives. And in India, astrology was very important for determining, the times at which one should perform specific rituals. But later on, it becomes important for determining when a king should go to war. It becomes important for determining how you should and when a king should be coronated based on the time that he's born. It becomes important in medicine. It becomes important, so all these different ideas that become connected with it, I think are important for understanding how and why these ideas came up, and how they continue to be used, and how they continue to evolve.
That's great. I think one of the really fascinating aspects of your work is that you are able to engage with two very different regions, right? The ancient Mediterranean and ancient South Asia. And that really says amazing things about your skill sets and your abilities. But I'm wondering, in sort of disciplinary terms, do you think of yourself as a classicist who happens to study Sanskrit, or are you a Sanskrit scholar who also does classics? And I'm wondering what's at stake either way.
Yeah, that's a tougher question, I think. I'm definitely a classicist in my philological training, doing all the language training and all of that. And I think even as a Sanskritist, a lot of the great Sanskritists have good, language chops, right? That's really where you can get into analyzing these texts, and especially newer texts like this. So part of my, I think, training philologically is as a classicist, and a lot of my intellectual background and my interest in these ideas in ancient India, how these ideas developed, came from my classics undergraduate degree and my training there. But another part of it, I have a degree in neuroscience as well. I have a bachelor's in neuroscience. And so part of it is also trying to understand what science was back then and what it is now. And part of that is this philological training, is trying to understand how these different ideas developed. But I think when I come into analyzing the texts and trying to make sense of them, I'm open to adopting ideas that are used in, or theoretical frameworks that are used in the religious studies. I find that, I think probably because I had to take courses over in the religious studies department, I have to engage with the frameworks that they use in analyzing the Sanskrit literature. And it's not always a model that applies well to classics, but I think that the interface between the two produces some interesting results. And that's what I'm hoping to show with my own work.
That's really interesting. And I think the sort of the example you were talking about how this astrological system ends up getting used in two different cultures is a wonderful way to investigate this sort of problem. And one of the things I find fascinating here is that it is, as you say, the same system, but it's used in different ways. So I'm wondering, I don't know if you could speak a little bit about how it comes to be that two different cultures might adopt the same system, but then use it in different ways. You know, what determines what system a culture would find interesting and useful, and then how do they decide how to use it?
Yeah, and I think that, especially with something like astrology, which appeared to apply to a bunch of different aspects of both Indic and Roman life, by the time it comes into India, where you have medical sciences, Ayurveda, which has been in use for at least a half a millennium. You have religious soteriological frameworks where you have these not only Brahminical religion, but you also have the Buddhists, you have the Jains, and many, many other sects, religious sects that are developing at the time. What you find is that individual ideas like this, right, and not entire texts are moving around. And with something like the Melothesia, with something like the Zodiac, which can find a connection to systems that already are in place. So in India, you had Jyotisha, which was the science of the lights, right, which was ancient astronomy and astrology, all sort of put together. You find that this Western zodiac and the Melothesia find a connection there. The zodiac finds a connection because you have the 360 degrees that the planet moves, or rather the sun or the moon, depending which system you're using, moves through the signs. You have the 28 asterisms that are then mapped onto the 12 zodiac signs. So the 28 Sanskrit asterisms, the nakshatras that are mapped onto the 12 zodiac signs. So you have this similarity there foundationally, but and so that allows these newer ideas to take hold. But what I find, and what I'm writing about in a different part of this, is the religious frameworks that had to be in place for astrology to work. So in the Roman system, you have augury, you have divination, and early on, you get this idea that the Romans have a very complex and very old idea of earthly and mundane and sort of cosmic connectivity. So there are these objects and elements that are all interconnected, and you see this through when you analyze the systems of augury, the different connections that they talk about with, for instance, with the color red. There are connections made between rust on a scythe. There are the sacrifice of red puppy dogs to prevent the rust from, or sorry, the rust mildew from taking over the crops and killing all the crops. And so the Romans say, let's sacrifice red puppy dogs so that Sirius, the brightest star which appears red in the heavens, doesn't get angry, right? So you have all of these connections that are being made that date back very, very, much before astrology comes on the scene. But when astrology comes on the scene, there's this interest in specifying these connections a bit more concretely, making sense and organizing the world in a different way. And you have a political shift that occurs, right? So in Rome, astrology gets picked up primarily, it's around, but it gets picked up during the imperial period. In India, you have the system of connections called bandhus, which are essentially, it's the same root as bonds in English. So you have these metaphysical connections, these bonds that go between the individual and the materials, the natural world around them, all the way up to the realm of divinities and the different planets and the stars themselves. So these systems that exist already, right, lay the sort of foundations for astrology to come in and be picked up. And when ideas are moving between the two cultures, so initially it's a movement of something like the Melothesia and the zodiac signs from the West, the Mediterranean, into India. But it's in the Sanskrit text already, in the Yavana Jataka, you see a development where there are concrete connections made to medicine. Ayurveda, the system of the doshas, right? That's already talked about in the Sanskrit text. And over the next few centuries, as Arab scholars pick up these ideas and move them back across, right? They take them from India and move them back across to Europe. You see how these ideas are all getting mixed up. And that's something I'm looking forward to investigating a bit more. But the Melethesia shows up in medieval manuscripts. It becomes sort of the basis of medicine all the way up through the Victorian era. So you have doctors who consult horoscopes in order to figure out when they should bleed their patients to make sure that the moon isn't in the zodiac sign that they were born under, or the moon isn't in the zodiac sign of the body part that they need to bleed, right? So these ideas, they stick around for a really long time, even though they are sort of mocked as not being truly scientific.
Wow, that's really wonderful and such fascinating stuff. And I love that you're able to study how systems move, and not just through space and culture, as you've been describing, but through vast stretches of time as well. And it seems to me that there's some important lessons there for how we think about transfer and change of knowledge today as well. Thanks so much for sharing your work with us. Really looking forward to seeing more of your scholarship and writing in the future. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you so much.